Should be a lot of smiling faces. The sun is out, and I know that makes me smile. I only had to let the car warm up for about 5 minutes this morning instead of the usual 35. So that was good. And I'm ready. I'm ready. They keep threatening with warm weather, and I'm ready to take them up on their offer. So, pretty excited about that. We had a good time at men's conference this past couple of days. We went on Friday night and Saturday. Men's conference was really good, and we might give some men an opportunity to be able to testify about that in the next service. But Brother Aaron Soto and Stan Gleason were the speakers, and really spoke some challenging word and concepts into us to call us up to a better and a higher place. And so really been encouraged by that. And of course, I know it was a good time being to get together with the men. And by Friday, we were able to openly joke about, I was going to say we were all able to talk about our wives, but I decided not to say that. We had a good time, good fellowship, good communion with one another, and glad those that were able to go, and just encouraged by that. So, amen. Well, we are sort of running a little bit behind. I know you guys don't really care maybe how long a series runs, but I feel like I'm running a little bit behind because of the snow days and things that we've had. But we're continuing our the series that we started several weeks ago, talking about an invitation to discipleship. And we talked about how when somebody steps into, or the approach to discipleship and sort of what everybody goes through as they enter into that place of being discipled, and some of the challenges and some of the things that we go through. And I think even later on in life, as we call ourselves again or resubmit ourselves to discipleship, some of the things that we run up against. I think if we're honest with ourselves, there's a lot of times where we plateau, and we kind of get things going good, and we're able to hit our spiritual walk, and we're able to hit Christianity's cruise control button, and we kind of are able to just kind of go, and we have to, times like men's conference, where we get to go and be able to be challenged again and realize that I need to resubmit myself to discipleship. I need to try to be taking myself farther, that however that is. And maybe when I say an invitation to discipleship, it's more of an invitation to growth, an invitation to become better and to advance maybe in our life. And any time that you step into that kind of a world where you're leaving one thing and trying to step into something else, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be conflicts, there's going to be some things that we run into internally that we have to deal with in order to make room for the new. Old things have to pass away so that things can become new, and so it's not a foreign concept, but sometimes that awareness. So the approach to discipleship, and then once you're in, it's kind of the things that happen. And as you're being discipled as well, to watch as things change, especially once you've been being discipled, to continue in that, to recognize what it should look like while we're going there. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is the community of believers and what that looks like, the diversity and the complex community of believers that when we step into discipleship, what that should look like, and what we should not fight against. And so hopefully that'll be a little bit clearer. But in starting of all of this, again, just to bring the summary, that invitation to discipleship, we realize that before somebody can step into a place of where they're being discipled and they're inviting Christian disciplines into their life, they need to know who it is that's calling them into that discipleship. So it's important to know Christ. And we understand that in that place of discipleship, we're pursuing a relationship with Jesus Christ. In all things, it's so easy to get distracted with the disciplines themselves, and it's so easy to get distracted even with purpose in saying, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, that we sometimes can forget that really in all of this, we're really pursuing a relationship with Jesus Christ. We're trying to get to know Him more so that He might be more accurately reflected in our lives. And so we realize and we recognize that it's Christ that we're responding to and following Him. And so that as we step into that our borders, our definitions are going to change. They're going to be broadened. In other words, our worldview will change. The way that we approach life, the way that we approach church, the way that we approach God. All of these things are going to change. And then a way that we approach others and the manner in which we behave and interact with other people, it's going to change. When you step into, and I'm going to use broad generalities, but when you're operating within the world system, people become tools and items that you use in order to advance yourself. So if you have a business, people, you're trying to get them in the door to buy your stuff or to help promote your business, and they become a means to an end. Whereas when you step into and start to embrace the worldview that Christ offers, it changes, and now people aren't something that I use to advance myself, but rather people are something now that I'm serving. People are now people, and I see them, and I'm trying to reconcile them back to Christ. And it's different. It's not somebody that I use, and they're not problems to be overcome, but rather they are people that need to be saved, that need to be brought to Christ. And so it changes. And in those that are in community, we serve one another in helping to meet those needs. And so it's different. It's different the way that we approach others. And so we recognize that worldview is changing. And so we then learn to live in a world that most likely will reject this new worldview. Yet we understand that we are discipled to serve and to minister to them. So that's kind of where we had approached to. And last, if I'm not mistaken, and if I am mistaken, forgive me. It may be a recap again, but I think last week we came to the place to where we saw how the mission changed a little bit to those who were being discipled. The initial people that were called immediately out of Judaism, and so foundational for them, the call and the appeal to people in Judaism. To Christianity, there was a certain approach that was taken. But Jesus called them. He said, I want you to start here, start in Jerusalem, but I want you to go to the uttermost parts of the earth with this message. I want you to go and spread this gospel message. Well, what happened, what they found, was that the further that they got away from Judaism's influence, or the Jews' religion of the day, once they got away from that, their approach to people had to change. Because when you're reaching out to Jews and you're saying, listen, Christ came to fulfill the law. And he came and he did what the law could. And he is the Messiah. That only had meaning to the Jews. You step out into a Gentile world that doesn't have the law and doesn't have this idea of a Messiah, then your approach to them has to change. Because that sales pitch doesn't work. And so we see then, as we read through the New Testament, and as the gospel spread, and as it began to go farther away from that Judeo-centric model of earth, as it got further away from that, they changed. And what we see being taught then, how we see the mission kind of evolving, it's still we're outreaching and still we're spreading this gospel, but now we don't lead with, look at how it fulfills Judaism, look at how the Messiah has come in that context, but rather we see where they start leading with lifestyle. And they say, listen, as you step into that, and as you become a follower of Christ, and as your worldview changes, your behaviors and the things that you do, people are going to notice that. And so you need to be very aware of what you're reflecting in your life, what you're doing, and how you're reflecting this new lifestyle, because that then becomes your witness. People step in, people lean in and say, hey, listen, you used to be this wild, crazy, partying kind of person, but now you're not. What has changed? And that's when you get to say, well, my worldview's been changed. There's this thing called the gospel and Jesus Christ, and it opens up that door. And it's different. It's now not, look how different we are from Judaism. It's now, look how different this worldview makes me from the way that the rest of the world normally operates. And so there was that shift. There was that adjustment. And we can read through Acts and we can see how that early church struggled to make that adaptation. That even when it began to step outside, initially to just step outside the bounds of Judaism, to reach to the Gentiles, they really had to wrestle with that. And they're like, wait a minute, is this for the Gentiles? Pierre says, yeah, man, I had visions, and God told me, don't call anything unclean that I've made clean. I want to reach out to them, and and the Holy Ghost was poured out on them. And so they're like, well, listen, he said, take it to the uttermost parts. This feels good to us in the Holy Ghost. Let's go with it. And so as they started to do that, and as they started to reach out, as they started to expand the boundaries of community, okay, what used to be just converted Jews or just Jews who stepped into Christianity, as they expand that community to include Gentiles, all of a sudden, even their issues changed, right? Because now they're not just fighting against breaking people away from Judaism. Now we're fighting against a lot of other sins, and we're fighting against a lot of other things. And now new issues that would never have been an issue. If it had stayed just within Jews, circumcision would have never become an issue. But now when you start bringing uncircumcised into the community, now you have to say, okay, what do we do with these guys? What do we now do with this? Right? As long as you're within Judaism, as long as you're within that Hebrew religion, the idolatry, it's kept at bay. It's kept outside. But then when you start reaching into a people where that's active, all of a sudden that becomes a greater issue of, okay, well, what should this look like now? What should this look like for? And so things began to change as the community changed, and they were forced to adapt. They were forced to work with that and understand, listen, God deals, and this is, I think, some of the beauty of the God that we serve, is the fact that he deals with people, and he understands that we're all different. And he allows us to process where we're at and what we're going with. And while there are a lot of commonalities, and while there are a lot of things that we are all growing towards together, there is that allowance to say your journey is going to look different than my journey. I'm thankful. I am thankful. I've never had to fight the battle of alcohol, and I've never had to fight the battle of cigarettes. It was around me. It was in my family. I saw it, but I was never, and I know people that is like that monkey on their back. That is the thing that drives their guilt. That is the thing that drives that affects their worship. And I have to understand that their walk's going to be, I might have a different struggle. Mine might be more internal. Mine might be more like jealousy. I might fight jealousy more. You know, we just come to men's conference, and it was a beautiful facility, this huge building, and they had sanctuaries and in this big gymnasium, and the gymnasium was heated, and it was an awesome, it was a beautiful place. And it's easy for jealousy to creep in, or envy, and the root of that is pride, to say, man, how come that's not here? So I have to fight those. And other people might say, you know what, I'm content with what I've got. I've never really been concerned with what everybody else had. But their battle and their struggle is going to be different. And we all have that. We all have our own struggles, right? And so as we talk about this, as we go through this, we're going to explore that a little bit more, because there's inherent dangers. There's inherent dangers in community that if we're not careful, we can limit our community. And I'll try to get to that here in just a second. We can limit our community. So we understand then those that are approaching, stepping into, and then those that are developing within that community, we understand that we are being called, not only to discipleship, but in that discipleship, we're being called to what we're going to call complex communities of faith. Complex, which means it's not simple. I wish I could remember the man who said it, but he said, listen, ministry is messy. And if you are intent on keeping everything neat and clean, you're going to be frustrated for the rest of your life. You have to understand that ministry is messy. People are going to goof up. People are going to do things that you wish they hadn't done. There's going to be messes that have to, and that's just the way that it is. When you love people, Jesus, he dealt with a lot of difficult people. Not just his disciples, but even the people that he healed. I mean, it was messy. It was messy. That was not a perfect world for him. And so we understand, then the Christian life calls us into this community with others. And there is no way to get around that fact. And so we are called to interact with other believers. And this we call edification, to build one another up. We are called to interact with each other in that capacity, in which we could probably stay there for a while. I could probably throw out the question and let it linger to say, how are you edifying anybody else around you? Within just this, our limited community of believers here, how are you edifying others? Not just a are you, to a yes or no kind of, but how? And I think there's something to that. I think there's the answer to that question reveals to us whether or not we're actually disciples of Christ. Because when those who he called around him to be disciples, he says, now listen, I'm pouring into you so that you can pour into others. You've got to be able to go and do that. And if you're not, then you're not doing what I've asked you to do. And I'm not saying that it's your job to run around and shake hands with everybody and make sure that everybody's welcome, and to, if you see anybody leave, you have to run and hold the door for them at the restroom. I'm not saying that kind of stuff, but it's what we started off the beginning of the year with. Pick somebody. Pick one person. Pick one family. And look for them. Pray for them. Greet them. Smile at them. Let them know that somebody cares about them. Do what you can. Take them out to eat. Buy them some coffee. Do something. We try to invite that kind of stuff. And we try to create those things. Those of you that are in the ladies' ministries, and you have that thing called Secret Sisters, that's what you're doing. You're choosing somebody to touch. You're choosing somebody to touch their life occasionally, to let them know that they have value, and to invite them and to bring them into that sense of community. And if you're being a true disciple of Christ, you're going to find those opportunities. You're going to be doing that. And so I ask us, how are you doing that? And let me throw this out. It can be as simple as a phone call. It can be as simple as a text message to say, I just wanted to let you know I'm praying for you. But do something. Find some way to edify, to build up somebody else, because that's what we've been called a part of. We're called to be a part of this community. We're in this thing together. Whether or not you like the person across the aisle, you're in it with them, all right? And if we all do this right, they're going to be in heaven too. And I'm sure God will put your mansions on other sides of heaven so you guys don't have to interact. I get that, but we're called into that community of believers where we're supposed to build up and edify one another. And we're called to interact with others who are not yet believers. So it's not just interacting within our community, but we understand that we're impacting those that aren't here in the attempt to invite them into our community. And so when we say, listen, I want you to come to my church, it's not just, I want you to come to my church, but it's, listen, I want you to come. I want you to experience this thing called reconciliation, this salvation, and you explain that and say, now listen, we're a part of a community. We work together. We edify one another, and we want you to be a part of it. There's value that you have to offer our body, and we want you to come. We want to be able to invest in you, and we know that there's things that you're going to be able to invest in us, and we want to grow our community. That's why we put on the business cards. We're trying to develop healthier individuals and families. The only way that we can do that is if we draw from one another. We're trying to do that, and we want you to come and help us to be a healthier community. That's what we're calling for. And so such statements, they seem so obvious, and they seem so easy to amen. But then when the time comes for us to practice this, it's like, I love people, I just don't want to deal with them, right? And sometimes when we're called to actually start practicing, to start doing the things that discipleship requires of us, it's easy to default to blame or excuses in order to keep ourselves outside of uncomfortable interactions. And I know that for some people, they are bubbly, outgoing, and there is never an awkward moment for them. And there are others that for me, like for example, for me, every interaction I have feels awkward. I got a smile on my face and I'll greet, but I'm telling you what, I am racking my brain to be as interesting as I can when I talk to each and every one of you guys. I mean, I am desperately trying to be interesting, desperately trying to find something to be able to talk about. And so every interaction just about feels awkward to me. And it would be easy for me to say, I don't like awkwardness. I gotta step out. I'll come and preach at them, and then I'm out. You know, it would be easy to do that. But that's not what he's called me to be a part of. He's called me to be a part of a community, right? And he's called me to be a part of that. And so it's pushing beyond some of those. It's awkward sometimes to initiate a conversation about God. Sometimes it's difficult to transition from, man, I can't believe what gas prices are, to Jesus loves you. I mean, there's not an easy segue sometimes, right? And those can create awkward. And it's easier to avoid those tense and awkward situations than it is to just dive right in. And again, there's some people that love that. They love that awkwardness. They love catching people off guard and get people on their heels, because then it's like, okay, now we get to, you know, their guards down, they're on their heels. Let's get the gospel in there. And they thrive at that. But I think what we understand, I think what we're all aware of, I think what we all experience at Christmas and Easter, family reunions, is that when you come together in community, problems arise. Whether it's a small community of just your own family, or whether you step into the larger community of the family of Christ, issues come up. Issues come up. Because what you have is you have a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life that are coming together into one ever-enlarging community of believers. And the fact of the matter is that the more people that come and become a part of this community, the more issues we're going to have. The easy thing is to say, I really love it when we see 50 on the attendance board. I like that. That's comfortable. I'm able to manage those issues. I don't want it to go any higher than 50. It's easy to do that because we're avoiding issues that may come. But there's inherent that Jesus never called us to be a closed-off community of believers. And in fact, we're going to see, hopefully, if I can shut myself up long enough, we're going to get to that place where we see Jesus addressing those kinds of issues. But it's going to look different. It's going to feel different as the community grows. But it's instinctive in us, I think, sometimes to avoid differences, because differences bring tension. Tension brings conflict, and conflict can create division. Right? That's businesses split, churches split, families split, when differences and tension aren't properly managed. And I think we need to not deceive ourselves into thinking that because we're a church, we are immune from differences or from tension or from conflict. Because the fact of the matter is, while Christ is in us and we have his Spirit in us, we're no different. Just because we walk in this door, we're still the same person we are that when we got mad driving in and somebody cut us off. We're that same person. We're still people, right? And so it's important then, and I think this is where the challenge falls to all of us, me particularly, but to all of us, to create a culture. And when I say culture, I mean an expected way of doing life, an expected way of doing living, to create a culture of growth and development so that everybody that comes understands that nobody is finished growing. That there is nobody in this house that is finished developing into what Christ wants them to be. Because I can tell you this. I can tell you, one of the things that frustrated me a lot. I won't go that way. I know it frustrates me sometimes when people say, I can't go to your church because I'm not or I don't. I remember when I was young trying to reach out and invite people to church, and they're like, well, isn't your church the one that does X, Y, Z? I'm like, well, yeah. And they're like, yeah, I don't think I can go. You know what I mean? And it became a barrier for folks. And what had happened is we inadvertently created a closed system that nobody could break into. They felt like we had, however it worked, we had communicated to everybody outside of our community that we had arrived. That we had come, and that there was no room for people that still needed to grow. For people that were still working on issues in their life. When that was not the fact. That was not the case. There were a lot of people that were still struggling with stuff, but it wasn't apparent. It wasn't made known to the outside world. That's why, have you ever had people say, I can't come because I don't, or I can, or I haven't done this, or whatever? Right? You say, no, that's okay. Listen, we're all in process. And that's what I mean. It's that expectation. It's that expectancy that it's not, you ought to have this thing together after you've been here for 6 months or after you've been here you ought to have it all together. That's not what we want to communicate. We want to communicate, Paul said, every day I have to die. Every day I'm growing towards something. Oh, that I might know him, they said. And these are guys whose writings made it into the Bible, for Pete's sakes, and they're saying, oh, that I might know him. It's like, okay, if that guy can make it into the Bible and his right, then it ought to be okay for me that I'm still growing. Not that we try to live in a state of struggle. Not that we try to live in a state of not accomplishing anything, but I understand that there's always something for me to advance in. And that with that expectation, it welcomes those that are just starting a journey, and it encourages those that have stagnated and plateaued to keep moving forward. And everybody knows that we're still heading somewhere. We're still trying to get somewhere. We need that culture of growth and development. And I think in doing that, we more effectively meet one another's needs. We create then environments. If everybody in this house says, I need to be better, and what I need to be better is whatever you want to call it. So you know what? One of the areas that I need to be better is in my finances. And I would love if there was a class that I could go to help me get my finances in order. You know what? Everybody in the church may not go to that class, but there might be somebody else who says, you know what? I could handle that too. All of a sudden, you've created a small community of believers that says, we're trying to build ourselves better here. Somebody else says, you know what? I really need to work on my marriage. Man, we're at one another's throats all the time, and it's just easier not to talk than it is to try to live with them. You know what I mean? And I just need help with my marriage. And somebody else is going to come along and say, you know what? And it doesn't matter at what stage of quote-unquote Christianity they're at. It doesn't matter how long they've been in church. If you've got a need, you've got a need. And so somebody who just came into this, or somebody who's thinking about stepping into Christianity, they again are able to come alongside somebody who's been in Christianity and saying, you know what, I've been in this for 30 years and I still need to work on my marriage. And somebody's like, oh man, that's so refreshing. I thought I had to get my marriage together before I could come to your church. It's like, no, that's what we're doing in our church. We're trying to create places where we can create healthier families. That's why we wanted you to come. I'm so glad that you came, because your family might be struggling with something that my family's not. I can help you and you can help me. We're creating those environments. And so the ironic, and I don't know if ironic is the right word, I always use it wrong. But it is, as much as it is the differences within a complex community that create those tensions and those issues, it is the differences within a community of believers that offers so much to the body. It's like the blessing and curses. It's the two sides of one coin. Yeah, you're going to have a lot of issues, but at the same time, the more people that you have, the more opportunity to minister, to be ministered to, you're going to have. And so differences then become distinct ingredients to creating a successful, purpose-driven community. And again, the more people that come in, there's going to be politics, there's going to be theology, any item that you can think of, the color of the carpet, the color of the paint, the type of light fixtures, there's going to be something that you can find issue with. And as it grows, there's only going to be more things that you have opportunity to disagree with. But they can either be a source of ministry to you and allow those differences to reveal issues that need to be addressed in you, or they can become reasons for division. But if we're responding properly to discipleship, for example, I'll never forget one of the most, and this is going to sound weird, but one of the most disappointing experiences of my life was when I was in Scotland. My wife, just walking, she can attest to this. We were there over Thanksgiving, and we were all getting together at Brother and Sister Kelly's house for this big Thanksgiving dinner. And so we had people from all over. She was from Florida, I was from Ohio. We had another girl that was from Hawaii, Louisiana. There was a bunch of from all over the place. So we all were able to bring individual items from kind of our own background to say, this is what I remember about Thanksgiving, and here's my food that I'm offering. And so we all come together, and I'll never forget, there was the girl from Louisiana. She could cook really good, and she brought this bowl of mashed potatoes, and it was a heaping bowl, and they were just tinted yellow, and the butter on top, and it was just melting. And I remember looking at that and thinking, I mean, my mouth, it was weird because it was just mashed potatoes, but at the same time, it was like, man, I cannot wait. And when we went through the line, I grabbed a big spoonful of it, and I had this big heaping pile of mashed potatoes because I was like, man, the butter, it just looked so good. And I stuck my fork in, and I put that in my mouth, and my world fell apart. I have never in my life, and what would possess somebody to do this, I'll never know. I will never know. But she made her mashed potatoes with mustard. And they didn't taste buttery. They didn't taste creamy. It tasted like mustard. And I don't like mustard. You talk about disappointing. So disappointing. I was still able to enjoy the rest of the meal, kind of. It was still like this constant, because here was the problem. It still looked good. Even after I could move on and eat the rest, it still looked good. And I wanted to try it and think, maybe I was wrong, but it was like, and you know what? When we come into a community, what that was a diverse group of people coming together trying to share a similar experience, right? That's church. We have a diverse group of people that come in, and a lot of us bring in ideas and say, hey, this, and for me, that's not what mashed potatoes look like. I'm sorry. For some of us, it's like, you know what, I can't. There are some people that don't like real mashed potatoes because all they've ever had is instant. And other people are like, I can't stand instant because all they've ever had is real. There's other people that want onions in theirs. Other people want lumps. No, I don't want lumps, right? Everybody's got their own thing. And that can either be a reason to not get together, or it can be an opportunity to broaden our palate. And we all have ideas of what church ought to be, right? We all have our expectations of what ought to happen when we come into the church, what it needs to feel like, what it needs to taste like. And here's the deal. The more people that come, it's going to change. The church experience right now is different than if we were to be a church of 500. That's a different church experience. That's a different way of operation. That's a different way of... Now, if we were to go from that to 500 like overnight, if next week we came and this place there was 200 people and it was standing room only, okay, that would be a shock to the system, right? That would be overload. But as we grow into this, that's what I'm talking about. We grow into that community of believers, we understand that we're broadening, we're making room, and we're expecting that kind of change. And that when things change, it's not because it's not a bad thing. It means that there's new experiences coming in. There's new opportunities to minister and to be ministered to. Differences within community are unavoidable. And and here's the danger. If we try to keep the community only those who think like I do, then I am going to limit that community and it will never grow. How many people in the world do you think have experienced exactly what you've experienced in your life? And if you want a community of people that have only gone through what you've gone through so that they think like you think and dream like you dream, you're going to be lonely. We need diversity. We need diversity within our, and Jesus taught this. He preached towards this. This was an expectation that hopefully we'll get to here in just a moment. And so what are the things then that create a complex community? Various levels of development in our spiritual maturity. There are people that have been in church for 50 years. There's going to be people that have been in church for 50 minutes. There's different levels of growth. That creates difference. That creates diversity. Men and women. That can create diversity. That can create tension, right? You want to watch people squirm a little bit? Let's talk about husbands or wives submit to your husbands, right? Some of you wives, you got your hands in your pocket and you just clenched a little bit. You know, I felt... You want to go into it, creates things. You just deal, there's different things, men and women. Multicultural, multinational. What's it feel like all of a sudden if we have an influx of, say, Filipinos? Or if ultimately, because of my passion for Chinese food, we have a nice little Chinese community of believers in here. How does that feel different? How does it feel different if we start having Hispanics come? Somebody from a completely different country. It's going to feel different, right? Because here's what's... They're bringing to the table a different way of doing church. And we can either welcome that, or that can become opportunity for division. And either I get offended and leave, or I offend them so that they leave because I need to keep my community small. I need to keep my community like me. And that's not what we're looking for. That's not what Jesus taught. That's not what he expected. There's going to be, here's another one, different sin backgrounds. There are people who would make, their lifestyle would make the devil blush. Right? And there's others who, their most severe sin probably is something that others wouldn't even think was a sin. There's different levels of severity of the background from which we come. Right? But it's not, those don't become reasons to exclude somebody. Right? Different socioeconomic. In other words, you're going to have people, Lord willing, in Jesus' name, we start converting some doctors, nurses, and dentists. We get some people in here like that. And you start, they're going to deal differently. They're just going to interact differently. You have white collar, blue collar. There's a reason why they have that. Somebody's going to make $150,000 a year. Somebody's going to make $15,000. Do they do life differently? Absolutely. But does that mean that they can't interact? Does that mean they shouldn't? No. This is the complex community part of it that Jesus is wanting us to be a part of. Each have their own issues. Each culture is going to have different things to deal with. But again, if we create that culture, that expectancy of life, of growth and development, it's going to say, let's grow together. Let's grow together. And so here's some of the ways. Matthew 13 is one of that whole chapter. There's a lot of parables that Jesus gives there as he talks about. And in his parables, there's so much diversity. Listen to how he does this. He starts off. It gives us a little bit of insight into what a community of believers just might look like in his mind. Here's what he says. He says, there was a farmer that was sowing seed. And as he sowed the seed, there was some that fell on different kinds of ground, right? Some fell by the wayside, some fell on the path, some fell on rocks, some fell, right? The seed was the same, and even to an extent, the manner of delivery was the same. The farmer was sowing it, right? But there were a different kind of people that were present. We won't raise hands, but there are stony people. They're just not flexible. They're just not. There's people that get walked on and are hardened because they've been walked on, like walking in a path. And there are people that have had benefits of life, and they are softer, and they're more receptive to receive. You know what that is? That's diversity. That is a diversity of people in a community. How do you know they're in a community? Because they're hearing the message from the same guy. They're at least in the proximity of the guy that's delivering the gospel. But the thing is, there's a different group of people. Everybody receives the word differently. He expected that there was going to be diversity within the community. He moves on and he starts talking about, he moves from there and he starts talking about the mustard seed. He says, yeah, the mustard seed, it's really small, but it grows into a large tree. And the crazy thing is, he didn't talk about the mustard seed creating more mustard seeds. He said, you know what, that mustard seed, it grows and then it becomes a home for birds and shade. It was like all of a sudden, I don't know why the mustard theme all of a sudden. That's twice. All of a sudden then, he talks about even the diversity of here is something that seems to be one thing, but as it grows, its function changes. What goes from as a seed, you can do whatever they do to it. They smash it, whatever they do to make it a seasoning element for food, or if you plant it, it grows, and it becomes a home for birds. I mean, how crazy is that? He's like, listen, there's going to be diversity. People are going to do some people are going to give shade, some people are going to give refuge, some people are going to add some flavor. Do we know anybody that adds flavor to our life? People are not always what they seem, but that's why we don't judge a book by its cover. We don't look at the mustard seed and say, there's no way. There is no way that you could ever provide anything for a bird. You're not big enough to be a meal. We judge it. You're no good. No. Cultivated and discipled and growth and development, all of a sudden that has potential that I can't see when it's just a seed. And the lives that come in here, we see them as mustard seeds, and we just don't know what that might grow into. We just don't know how that mustard seed or how whatever kind of seed that comes in this place, how can the seed turn into a house? Well, it takes some time, but it grows and it turns into a tree that they cut down, and then they cut it up, and now it becomes planks for a house. I can't see that just looking at a seed, but nor do I limit it just because it doesn't look like what I am. Kingdom of heaven, he goes on to talk about it. A kingdom of heaven is like yeast for a woman who's baking bread. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. You know what that tells me? That tells me that every person that walks in these doors affects the whole group in some way. You affect this community in a way that nobody else can. And you want a church to fall flat, remove yourself from it. That's what happens when you don't have yeast, right? It doesn't rise, it stays flat bread. I'm not a baker. I burn everything. Can't even do pancakes. Right? You want to withdraw yourself, that church is going to fall flat. But you engage and you allow people to, the church is going to rise. Because a little bit of leaven, a little bit of you is going to permeate the whole group. So think about, we're called into this community. Think about how we're infecting, however you want to do that. Think about how we are impacting our community of believers. How are we doing that? Hanging out too long there. So we need to ask ourselves, what is my leaven? What do I impact? Jesus' parables continue. He talks about a hidden treasure in a field. This particular one, he talks about the pearl merchant. He finds basically both of them. They find something of worth. They sell all of their possessions and everything that they've got so that they can have that land, so that they can get that treasure. And here's the deal. People will give a lot more. People will give a lot to be a part of a gospel-based community. How's my sense? Let me get away from it. People will give a lot to a gospel-based community that they perceive value in. That's how I want to say that. If you don't perceive value, then you're not going to give to it. You're not going to give anything to be here. If you don't perceive value, and if I can just make it as a matter of fact, if this place offers no value to you, then every excuse to not be here is going to be welcomed. But when you perceive value either in what you see the church becoming or what it actually is to you, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter what happens. I'm going to find a way to get there because it's important to me. Right? We perceive value in our jobs because we know that if I get to work, I get paid. And if I get paid, then I can live somewhere, right? And so it doesn't matter how bad or how little I have a headache. I got to get there to get my money because there's value in where I'm going. It doesn't matter how sick. I'll never forget one of probably the greatest and worst examples of my life was my dad. He owned a garbage route. And there was about, at its most expansive that it was, I think he had maybe a half a dozen employees. But he had no backup for him. So it didn't matter how sick he got, he had to go to work. Because you miss a day of garbage pickup, it's still there. And it just gets worse. It just keeps building up. And I can remember being on the garbage route with Dad where we'd be driving down the road and he'd stop, he'd pull over on a side road and he'd get out and he'd puke his guts out, climb back in and off we go. Why? There was value in what he was doing. Was it in the job? No, there wasn't value in the job, but in his family and the support of his family. I'm telling you, you'll make a way when there's value for you. You make a way. Now, I'm not saying you can't ever be sick, and I'm not saying, okay, because I get that. When you're sick, I don't want you to come and make everybody else sick. I'm not saying that, all right? But what I'm saying is if this place has no value for you, you're going to find reasons to not be here. You're going to find excuses not to give. There's a reason why we'll pay $5 for a cup of coffee, but yet I can't give more than $1 in the offering plate, right? One is perceived more value to me than the other. It's just plain and simple. I value the flavor. I value the whatever, the look of having a Starbucks coffee in my hand or whatever it is. Spending too much time there. Sorry. If we don't find value in the kingdom living and the kingdom discipleship, we will not invest in it. We won't invest our time. We won't invest our energy. We won't invest our finances. Then Jesus moves on. He talks about the kingdom of heaven. He says the kingdom of heaven, it's like a fishing net, and it gathers many items just to be sorted later. They throw out the net and they pull things in, and you get some good fish and you get some bad fish. You get some octopus and you get some octopi maybe, and you get clams. You get all these different things, and you pick out the things that you want and you throw back the things that you don't, right? That's how he presented it. What's he saying? He's like, it's the same way. He casts his net into this earth, and he draws it into a community. And when it comes together, there's a lot of different stuff in that net. But the fishermen, hear me, I want to touch on this in a little bit, probably next week, looking at the time. But the fisherman is the one that separates. He talks about it. He says they're going to be sorted label. When he explains that, he said the angels will be the ones who sort the good and the bad at a given time. At a given time. At a given time. He goes on and he says this. He talks about a story. He said there was a farmer who planted good seed. And then during the night, somebody came in and planted weeds where he had planted his seeds. And they didn't find out until later. And as it started to grow, all of a sudden his servants come in and say, oh my, somebody came in when we didn't see, and they planted weeds among the seeds. And so we've got wheat and we've got weeds out there. Do you want us to go and pull up the wheat? You want us to go and pull out the weeds? And the master says, no. Let them both grow together. And then when the harvest comes, the harvesters will be able to sort out between the two. Why? Because he knew if they start pulling out the weeds, it's going to damage the wheat. Allow the diversity to be there, he says. Allow there to be diversity. Allow there to be different kinds. But when the appointed time comes and I send the reapers, we'll let them sort it out. And that should take a lot of pressure off of a lot of us. I've been in places where there was an unspoken, it was an unappointed group of church police. And they made it their mission to police everybody that came into that church. Make sure I saw what they were doing, or hey, I saw what they didn't do, and and they policed everybody. What are they doing? They're running around trying to pull out the weeds. They're trying to weed the church. And the master said, no, don't do that. Leave that alone. There are things and there are places, there are times when we can address those sorts of things. I get there's going to be times where we reprove and we rebuke and things that happen. I get that. But listen, it's not our job to weed our community. He said when he comes back, when the trump sounds and he comes back and he collects the harvest, he'll sort it out at that time. He'll know the good and the bad. He'll sift the wheat. It's going to happen. But that's not ours. That's not our job. Both of these last two parables, it speaks to the mix or the diversity that exists within a community of believers. Weeds and wheat, good fish, bad fish. But the emphasis that he seems to put on this is the fact that the separation will be done without human agency. Because he said his servants wanted to go out and to separate. His servants wanted to go out and do that. And he said, no. I've got harvesters. Later on, we'll get to that. Human involvement in this kind of sifting would only serve to exacerbate the existing divisions that exist within a church. It's called anarchy when we start policing, when everybody is allowed to police everybody else. And I'll tell you this, that's not an environment conducive to growth. Because what's going to happen, you think that you're doing something, somebody's going to come along and they're going to pluck you up by the roots. They're going to see your sins and they're going to see your failings and they're going to come and try to harvest you. How do you feel when somebody comes and uninvitedly tries to tell you what's wrong with you? I bristle. I bristle when somebody comes up and says, hey, you know, especially somebody that I don't know, or even worse, somebody that I don't respect, comes up and says, you know what I've seen in your life? I think you really should. I'm like, that's not, they're trying to weed me. But listen, this is the deal. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addressed this very thing. He addressed the very inability of humanity to govern one another when he said, listen, don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye because you've got a beam in your own. What's he saying? He's like, listen, let the diversity be there. But because here's the deal, you are not equipped. You are not equipped to properly weed in that way. What we would rather do, and here's the thing, remember the mustard seed that grows into a tree and it does more things? We start plucking things out because it doesn't look like what we think it ought to look like. We just don't know what we've pulled out because we haven't given it opportunity. We have not given God opportunity to transition a life yet. If we rush in and we weed that life, then we have negated that any opportunity for that life to be transformed into anything else. That's why Jesus said, leave the weeding to me. Leave the weeding to the reapers. So so what that tells me, it says that we are learning to live then in this diverse community of believers. And I hope that we didn't hear that we're never going to talk about sin and we're never going to say sin is bad. It's not what I'm saying. There's still things that we are moving towards. In fact, that's probably what we're going to talk about next week. I don't know if we'll move into this a little bit more. But we understand that we're still being discipled towards something. We're still growing towards something else. And that God called me into this community of believers to operate in love and in mercy. And he said, you leave the revenge, you leave vengeance to me. You leave the reaping to me. You leave the weeding to me. You come in love and you come in mercy. And we're going to learn to live collectively in a community where we serve one another and where we reach out and we serve those that aren't yet a part of our community. But we've got to be open to that kind of expanding community of believers. We have to allow that diversity to come in. Jesus, I love and I thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it, God. And I don't know how I'm leavening this lump, God. I don't know how I'm impacting it, but I pray that you would help me to have an increasing awareness, Lord, of my impact on the world and the lives around me. And I pray that prayer for everybody, God. Help us to recognize our value, to keep ourselves a part of the body, because we know that when we remove ourselves, the bread falls low. And so I pray, God, that you would have your way in our lives and help us to continue to respond. Help us to continue to respond to being discipled, to discipling others. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's worship.